Hi, this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. So as promised, I've updated the CDFM module 2.1 visual out of the 2018 study guide. So there are a few minor changes in the name of the documents that I wanted to point out. So I'm going to walk through the whole defense budget process in a nutshell. So remember, it doesn't include everything that's in the study guide, but these are some of the major areas that you need to make sure you know, and then you can fill in the gaps once you get the information. And then I'm going to figure out how to, I think I have a Google shared drive where I can share the particular link if you want the diagram itself versus looking at a slide of me doing it. All right, so the first thing to remember when it comes to the federal budget or the defense budget process is that operational chain of command runs from the president to the Secretary of Defense directly to those combatant commanders, your COCOMs. And what that means when it comes to resources is the funding is primarily goes to the combatant commanders and to fill their needs. So that's why the operational chain of command is important. Remember who we said was the military advisor to the Secretary of Defense and the President? We said it was the Joint Chief of Staff, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. But if you look, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is not included in the operational chain of command. But when it comes to communication from the president and the SecDef, it will typically come through the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff to the combatant commanders. All right, so we talked about earlier the National Security Council members: President, Vice President, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Secretary of Energy, and they have the advisors, Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, Director of Intelligence, and then you have some other members, standing members that participate. But the end result of when they come out of the National Security Council is once they do their analysis of this threat that the country faces, they publish an NSS document, National Security Strategy document, called the National Security Strategy. So this was that big op order I was talking about. And so each of the agencies, Education, State Department, Department of Defense, they all take this big op order, National Security Strategy, and then pull out what specific things that they will be required to accomplish. So the DoD takes the National Security Strategy and then utilizes 3 decision support systems to make sure that we fall in line with that NSS document. So the 3 DoD systems, if you in your study guide, it's like 3 circles that overlap, and in the middle, they make up the defense planning guidance. But this your Jaycees, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System. We talked about the PPBE, Planning, Programming, Budget, and Execution. And the third system is a Defense Acquisition System. So Jaycees, we figure out what our shortfalls are. PEEB is where we figure out how we get our funding. If we have the capability and we need funding, we need to use the PEEB system to request the funding. And the Defense Acquisition System is a system we use if we do not have that particular item in our capability and we're going to need to develop it. We need to use the acquisition system. So these are the 3 DoD support systems that are used to come up with the defense strategy that meets the national security strategy. All right, so the first system is Jaycees, as listed here, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System. So what the Jaycees system is used for is to identify capability gaps. And if you've worked with TRADOC, you've heard this acronym, .MLPF. That's where you look at doctrine, operation, your training, your material, leaders, facility. You look at all those different aspects of that mission, and then you determine what particular area needs for you to look at. So what you see here is the Jaycees is a systematic method used by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to assess capability gaps. So once they come up with the national security strategy, and now we know what our defense strategy is going to be, because we're going to see that in the PPBE phase, then we need to identify capability gaps. We know what our shortfalls are. Now we need to figure out how we're going to fill the shortfall. So the oversight or executor of the Jaycees is the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So remember, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff provides SecDef an assessment of the gaps and recommendation to fill the gaps. So the chairman is the spokesperson that goes directly to the SecDef to give an assessment of, once they do this analysis, of what the capability gaps are and how they can fill it. The vice chairman, the worker bee, is the executor of Jaycees, and he also sits on another board. He's the chairman. He sits on three, really. So he's the executor of Jaycees. He's the chairman of the Joint Requirement, you see right here, Oversight Council, and he's vice chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board with the USDATNL. So that means the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is responsible for this system, and he sits on this one. And the chairman himself participates in the PEEP. So they are included in each one of the support system to make sure that we're meeting this national security strategy. Then the second part is PEEP. So if the capable, now let me point out something. When we look at the .MLPF, if it's, let's say, doctrine, we just need to change the doctrine. We need more positions. It might be, okay, now we got the positions. Now we need to ask for funding. So we go to the PEEP phase. If it's a material solution, what the M is, this is what triggers the defense acquisition system. So if it's the M in .MLPF, that's the way to fill that gap, then we're going to jump to the third system. But for this part, we're going to jump to the PPBE. So we talked about operational chain of command running to the combatant commanders. So how does the combatant commanders let higher know that they have some issues? Remember, IPLs, so integrated priority lists, are produced by the combatant commanders. They send to the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, the SecDef, the deputy SecDef, and the military department that's going to be responsible. Remember, they don't have any troops. The military department sends those combatant commanders the troops that they need or whatever requirements they have. So the IPLs goes to all these individuals as a heads up. Anything military related must be assessed by the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So the chairman does his assessment and recommendation of the IPL and military status related to strategy. The chairman is also the one that develops the national military strategy. Again, going back to that DOD, since it's the top military advisor, then it makes sense. They write the national military strategy. And then DOD comes up with the National Defense Strategy, Defense Strategic Guidance, Homeland Defense and Military Support, different particular strategy documents. All together triggers the planning phase of PEEP. So the planning phase of PEEP is the responsibility of the USD for policy, Under Secretary of Defense for Policy. The purpose of the planning phase is to develop a plan to meet the National BAGAP Order NSS document. So the final document produced by the DOD is the Defense Planning Guidance. Sends it down for all of us to see what the plan is supposed to be for the upcoming years. Once the plan is out, you see the Director of CAPE and the USD Comptroller issues POM and BEST guidance. Why do they issue the guidance? Because remember when I discussed this, I said that Director of CAPE and USD is responsible for the programming phase, and the budget and execution phase for the USD. So it sends down guidance to the agencies. So programming phase, responsibility of the director of CAPE. Programming phase is used to translate allocation of resources. Now we know the plan. Now we need to translate to allocation of resources. Then we talked about we submit our POMs. Combatant commanders send it to the components. So remember they send this to the military department. So their IPL information gets included if it's something they need included in the POM. Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff does his assessment and recommendation of the POM that we submit. And we talked about the decision support forums that meet to review those documents. And at the same time, remember, Future Year Defense Program, that Director of CAPE is updating the FYDP. At the same time, because this individual responsible for programming, USD Comptroller is responsible for budgeting, the budgeted phase is translate programs into appropriations. Submit requirements to component commanders for inclusion in the BEST. Commanders, being the chairman, give his assessment and recommendation of the budget request. The same forms again, review the budget, and then you record the budget information in the CIS, Comptroller Information System. Remember we said the CIS system comes here. DoD database, Comptroller Information System, FYDP, anything we need to update there in the budget side. And if you notice, the final document in planning was the DPG. The final document in the programming and the budgeting phase is the resource management decision. And so this is just saying we're updating the FYDP here. So an RMD for both goes forward. Remember, programming has an RMD and budget has an RMD, goes forward to the Office of Management and Budget. When it goes forward, remember we talk about in between here, they do a fall review to go over the DoD submission, the RMD here. So a draft RMD will probably come here when they do their review, because they might decide, they being OMB may decide that they don't like something in DoD, they can't justify it, so it may have to be updated. So I would say this is the draft RMD, and final after OMB approves their resource management decision for inclusion in the president's budget. The president is required to submit the budget to Congress no later than the first Monday in February. So it goes to Congress, then Congress, once they approve the budget, the appropriation we receive. We talked about the various appropriation, annual being MILPERS, O&M, 1 year, incremental, RDT&E for 2 years, full funding, procurement, and MILCON. The purpose of the execution phase is to monitor execution of the plan. So you see here, the same person in charge of budgeting is the same person in charge of the execution phase of P. And then the third DoD system we talk about is the Defense Acquisition System. Buy or develop what you need. So again, if it's a material solution, it will trigger the Defense Acquisition System. So Defense Acquisition Board is a senior DoD board that meets to discuss acquisition category 1 Delta projects. The chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board is the USD AT&L. This is the top acquisition guy at the DoD level. But remember, this guy up here, vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, is also a vice chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board. So he sits here also with that USD AT&L to provide oversight. So you have the chairman that's here in this process to provide oversight, and the vice chairman is with Jaycees and the Defense acquisition. So you see Jaycees identify capability gaps in .mlpf. If it's a material solution, triggers defense acquisition system, where you learn to buy, you either buy or develop what you need. If we're just asking for additional manpower or funding, because you need funding if you got manpower, the PPBE is used to determine how to pay to fill the capability gap, to make sure somewhere in the cycle that we ask for the money early enough so that when we need it, that funding is available. So in a nutshell, this is the CDFM Module 2.1 Defense Budget Process. So the differences is there's no longer a quadrennial defense review. It's called the National Defense Strategy. So I got to look at some other, and then future year defense program. It used to be 11 programs. Now there are 12 programs. Everything else kind of looks the same. So if I see any differences, I'll update accordingly. Thank you, and I'll see you guys again next time.